Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June 26 Risk Reduction Risk Management class, where we're going to talk about the June 26 new and revised forms release. There's been a few changes of some significance, and so we'll go through those and hopefully help you um, better put the use of the forms or put your forms to good use as you use them. Before we get started, I do have a couple of announcements, and I do want to have it on the recording so that folks who miss this will get this because they're pretty important. The first is regarding the CRMLS especially. Uh, I want to caution those of you that are members of the CRMLS that I don't know the rule number, but there is a rule against showing property that's in coming soon or excluded. Excluded or coming soon, you cannot show the property, period. Before showing it, it must be moved to active. There's a $750 fine, I believe, and I also believe there's no warning, because the CRMLS has an attitude that if you violate certain rules, the damage has been done by the violation. And warning you about don't do that doesn't relieve you of the obligation to rectify the damage you've done. So do not show property that's incoming soon or excluded. Now, San Diego MLS allows one-by-one individual showing. So you can't caravan it, you can't do open houses, but you or a co-broker, you can make an arrangement for that person as long as it's a single entity, a single party rather, viewing the property. That can be done for coming soon in San Diego. Cannot be done in CRMLS. So that brings up a second issue. We're going to research this to be certain. I thought about it, and there might be a way around this. But Zillow Preview, I have been saying that for CRMLS, you can't really take advantage of the preview. I don't want to officially change that at this moment, but we'll put an announcement out. It might be that you could possibly. And so here's the issue. With preview, you can arrange for a showing. And of course, if it's a San Diego MLS, it can be shown on an individual basis. So preview works just fine for San Diego MLS listings. Using preview as a way to schedule a showing for CRMLS could be a problem. And so we're going to check on that. We might actually talk. Lindsay's had some conversations with some of the people in the rules at CRMLS. She's done better than me developing some rapport over there. They're tough people to deal with, but she's doing research for us on that. And we'll find out if maybe there's a way to get around, as long as you don't show it, you could still at least preview it to announce it, but you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the button, interested in the property, let me see it, and then schedule a showing. That can't be done. So that's relative to excluding listings from the MLS or putting them in coming soon. I also want to talk a little bit about it. There's a little bit of confusion. We do have from time to time some issues, and sometimes the issues can be serious, and that's with signatures when the buyer or seller is an entity. So I want to clarify that a little bit, put a little more light on the subject, maybe give you a better feeling for it. So the first thing is anytime you have an entity, and someone is signing for the entity, you'll want to include an RCSD. And the good news is it's built into a listing contract, I believe the BRBC also, and the RPA. So it can be built in for the principals that are signing these contracts. And of course, the RCSD identifies the name of the entity, the authorized signer, and the signer's title. Now, what it is not is an authority document. It's more of a disclosure than it is granting the signer the right to sign for the entity. So we would still need an authority document. And so from time to time, either Lindsay or Erica notifies you, hey, we need an authority document because you got an entity signer here. Now, an entity cannot sign a document as an entity. And that's kind of common sense if you think about it. Why? Because entities don't have hands. Entities can't pick up a pen and sign it. So the signature, when the buyer or the seller is an entity, should never be the name of the entity. You have no contract. Courts have invalidated contracts that are signed by, the Walt Klein Family Trust. Of course, we'll say, well, Walt Klein Family Trust didn't sign anything because it's not able to sign anything. So this contract has never been signed. So be very careful with that. Make sure your signers are, in fact, human beings and they're a name. They're named. And then, of course, have a title that should go with it. So hopefully that's real clear. Now, I want to review the three types of entities that you deal with. And the first is, of course, a trust. And so a trust, the seller should include the title name trustee. Now, the good news is courts are somewhat lenient in that, especially if you've identified the trustee in the same document. We do ask you to be sure to get trustee on the documents because we want to be sure that there's no ambiguity. We want you to be in good practice because the other two entities do need titles on them. Absent titles will get you in trouble. So with a trust, the trustee signs the trustee's name, not the trust name, and then, comma trustee, real simple. If they're named in a RCSD that's attached to the document, again, it has to be part of the document. So my concern is the court might say, well, this RCSD that's a standalone form didn't count because it's not built into the RPA that you signed or the listing contract or buyer representation agreement. So just include the title of the trustee. Now, the other two entities, much more important, the titles included, because courts have done some severe damage to the people involved in what they thought they were doing. So the first one is when the entity is an LLC or a corporation. LLCs and corporations must, to maintain that level of separation between an individual and a person who's an officer or a principal inside the entity, they must have their title attached to their signature. Failure to have a title, president, after, signing for the Walt Klein Inc. organization would pierce the corporate veil, and courts have repeatedly made Walt Klein now responsible. I'm being hypothetical, but now individually responsible because I did not maintain the corporate veil by identifying myself as the principal. The president, rather, not the principal. So let me rephrase all that to be real clear. When persons who are officers or members, managing partners of LLCs or officers in corporations fail to put their title next to their signature, they have granted the ability of the other side to now hold that individual liable, and courts have done that. So always, 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 the title of the LLC signer or the corporation signer. Likewise, power of attorney. Courts are real strict about interpreting whether or not you've got a contract depending on how a power of attorney is executed, how the signatures are executed on the document. So with a power of attorney, order is very important. It's sort of semantics, but a power of attorney doesn't really give the signer, for example, authority to sell the house. Now you could say, yeah, they do. Yeah, because of the power of attorney, they can act for the person who granted them power of attorney, but they're not the owner. So a power of attorney that signs their name only to a document, you don't have a document. You don't have a contract. Courts have repeatedly done that. So the way to do a power of attorney is it's three things. The person who granted the authority, so grandma gives power of attorney to the grandchild. So the grandchild signs grandma's name first because grandma has the authority to sell the house. The grandchild does not. The power of attorney gives the grandchild the right to sign grandma's name to things. To make grandma responsible, but grandma has to say I'm responsible, or that at least that signature has to be on the document. So with the power of attorney, the person granting the power of attorney, that name appears. Now that signature will be the signature of the person holding the power of attorney. It won't match grandma's signature, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It'll match the grandchild's signature. So first, it's grandma's name, then it's the grandchild's name. The signature will look alike, but they're different names. And then a title next to that. What authority does the grandchild have to sign this? They hold the power of attorney. And so they would put either POW or attorney in fact next to their signature. And that is very, very important because courts have invalidated contracts that involve power of attorneys that the signatures were in the wrong order even. So that's very important to follow that. Hopefully it clarifies any questions. Lindsay understands this quite well. I think Erica probably does too. If you guys have any questions, Linda, of course, I know she does. So call Linda, call Erica, call Lindsay, call me if you need to. But they are maybe your first line of a quick call. Make sure you understand this. Hopefully that answers your questions and clarifies a few issues that have come up in the past. Again, the RCSD is not the authority document. You'll still need a copy of something that grants the sign or the authority to sign. That is, part of the trust or part of the or a copy of the power of attorney, or is included in the statement by the corporation that Walt Klein, VP of Acquisitions, can sign for my corporation. All right. Not my corporation, that would have to be an officer. All right, let's
Walt,
get
really
right into
quick.
the material for
Walt,
today. If I can,
Walt,
yes.
really quick. Ningret had a question about this specifically. What if they have power of attorney and also are the trustees? What do they write next to their name?
Okay, you call us on a case-by-case basis. That's probably not
Very
correct.
common.
Trusts do not usually grant power of attorneys. So they would sign as a trustee. They would not be signing because they're holding a power of attorney. I mean, why would you have a power of attorney if you're the trustee as well? What often happens is, I'm trying to do two things at once here. I apologize. Okay. What often happens is somebody who's not a trustee, because the trustee has granted a power of attorney to some individual, and agents believe, because they've been told that by the individual, oh no, I have a power of attorney, I can sign for the trust. Probably not. It's pretty unusual. Uh, does that answer the question?
I think so. And Ningret, you can contact us if you have further
Yeah,
questions on
yeah.
it.
So, okay. Let's get right into today's material. Of course, my contact information hasn't changed since I first made this slide years and years and years ago. Actually, I think Lindsay made it. My email address, easy to
You need to
email
share your
me.
screen, Walt.
Oh, I didn't share it. Oh, I gotta X out. I'm sorry. All right, what do I do? Share screen. Minimize this. Thanks, Lindsay. Share. What happened here?
You're sharing. You
Is
can
it
just,
sharing?
yeah, you can just close that.
Okay, I don't know what this is. Can I X this out?
Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
Lindsay's my go-to tech person.
Oh, just leave it.
Just
It'll
ignore
it'll be in
that.
the
Go on top of
background.
it.
Yeah.
Oh, now I'm really screwed up here. What am I got here?
There you go.
Hopefully this will work. Yay! All right,
There
everybody
we
see
go.
that?
Yes.
Okay. So contact information. Best way to reach me during business hours, although my cell phone is becoming more and more a part of my business day as well. But call the landline is my first choice, direct dial. and I pay more attention to my landline during the business day than I do my cell phone. But ultimately, you'll reach me either way. Of course, you can email me. Keep my email open. It's open now, even. It's minimized, but I keep it open from the minute I walk in till the minute I go home. So you can email me. And of course, evenings, weekends, call my cell. And as I like to say, if you're working, I like to be available. If you can't reach me, of course, and sometimes it might be easier for you to start with Linda or start with Lindsay, not on weekends. Uh, I'm married to this, but Lindsay's got a family that still needs her attention. Mine would just as soon I get busy on something else and don't bother them sometimes, so they're okay with me being busy on weekends. But same with Erica. So weekends and evenings, call me, and but during the week, by all means, call Lindsay, call Erica, call Linda. All right. New and revised forms for the June 26th release. I'm not going to cover every single form, but I'm going to cover the major changes, and hopefully that will give you the information you need going forward. These new forms are now part of the library, so these forms are now in play. Templates update with new forms. Transactions do not. You don't want a transaction form that's already been incorporated into a transaction to be changed because a change might not be something the principals would have agreed to. So your transaction forms don't change. Your templates should change, of course. Make sure you're using the latest form. Our E&O requires it, so that's important. Okay, the first, I'm going to talk about a few changes in the RPA. Nothing super major, but some interesting changes. So the first change is in paragraph 3G. And in 3G, we're all familiar with 3G3. That's where buyers ask the sellers to pay the buyer's broker. 3G1 and 3G2 have been for other credits. And what CAR has done is made a 3G2 a little more specific for those sellers that want to earmark a credit, or a buyer rather, or both, I suppose, that want to earmark a credit for a specific purpose. 3G2 would be checked, and then you would put the dollar amount and what you're using it for. So you could do just a general credit. You could even make other seller credits concessions, credit for concessions. So you could even do that. So it's just a little more information. It's important to note that credits in G1 and G2 are subject to lender approval. And many loan programs have caps. Some has around 3%, some as high as 6%, but they have caps on the amount of credit a buyer can receive from a seller. So G1 and G2, that is subject to lender approval. G3 is not. G3 does not count, lenders do not count the credit to pay the buyer's broker against the allowables that a seller can pay for the buyer, as long as it's itemized as a specific credit to compensate the buyer's broker, which is what G3 accomplishes. Okay, nothing really new there, but just a little more detail, if you will. Now, what is new is L2, 3L2, the appraisal contingency, and how that is covered when the buyer is willing to pay a little more than what it appraises for. And Carr has worked on this, a few different approaches trying to clarify this. Here's what you don't want. You don't want statements like buyer will pay $10,000 over appraisal. Okay. And the seller says, okay, yeah, that's good. What happens if it appraises for 100,000 less than the sale price? Well, then the buyer's going to buy it for 90,000 less the sale price. Well, the buyer will be thrilled. The seller won't be too happy. I don't know. So how appraisal contingencies and how much the buyer will pay over appraisal, if it's not handled carefully, it can screw things up. And SOCAR has made an attempt, and they've done a good job always, but it's been a little confusing. So now they believe, and I think they're probably right, that this clarification on this particular RPA is about as clear as it can be. And that is, if the buyer is willing to buy the home, even though it doesn't appraise for the purchase price, he can check this box and put the dollar amount less than the purchase price that it must appraise for. So, if the buyer was going to buy it for 950, and as long as it appraises for 925, I'll buy it. But if it appraises below 925, I don't want to pay the difference. I don't want to pay, that. And so they could check this box and put 25,000 in the blank. And that would be the appraisal gap. So that is very straightforward, and hopefully will clarify that. Where it gets confusing is when the sale price changes significantly from the list price. And when that happens, then this how much you're paying over appraisal becomes sort of problematic. The seller said, I'll pay 50,000 over appraisal, and it appraises for significantly more than the purchase price. Now he's got a problem because now he's paying significantly more than he thought he would. And that really comes up more when the counter takes the sale price up high. And now 50,000 over sale price. Well, I could do that when the sale price was 900,000, but when the sale price is $1.2 million, now I got a problem. I don't have that much money to pay that extra difference. So it's pretty straightforward now. Should not be too confusing. Hopefully I haven't confused you with these examples. Now, it's important to note, and they've added the insurance to the same concept. And the concept is that although appraisal and insurance contingencies are related to the loan, they are not a part of the loan contingency. So if a buyer waives their insurance contingency, and that's what this revision, because it's already existed with the appraisal, but now they've added the insurance. So in general, if a buyer waives the insurance contingency or waives the appraisal contingency, either one or both, and then cannot get insurance, he cannot use the loan contingency to bail on the contract and get his deposit back. Now, the loan will not fund because it didn't appraise, or the loan won't fund because the buyer can't produce insurance. But if the reason the loan doesn't fund is because the buyer can't get insurance, well, he can't get the loan, but the loan contingency would not apply, and you've already waived the insurance contingency. So hopefully that's really clear. There are some agents, I've heard agents say that it's okay to waive the appraisal contingency or now the insurance contingency because I still have my loan contingency. No, that will not work. Now, if you can't get the loan because you don't qualify, then completely different set of parameters. But if you can get the loan, but you can't because you can't get insurance, or it doesn't appraise for the amount that the sale price is, you would not be able to use your loan contingency to cancel and get your deposit back. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward. And now they also designate a little more information here about how the appraisal works. And so the next paragraph B helps explain that a little bit. That's in your handout. Okay. Now, a significant change in the RPA and the introduction of 2 new forms to replace one form is how septics, wells, propane tanks, and property boundaries is handled in the purchase agreement. So now in paragraph 3Q, if the property has either a septic, a well, a propane tank, or you're interested in having the property surveyed, you would check the box in Q 16. There it is, so you can see it. So, if you check the box in 16, then automatically the SWPI C applies. Now, you're going to see what the SWPI C is. That's a new form. We used to have the SWPI, right? Septic well, propane, a tank, and I think I'm not sure what the I stood for. I forget. But we've been calling it a SWPI for a long time. Carr now calls it a SWPI. I think that's pretty cool. So, and this is a who pays for various things associated with the septic, the well, a propane tank, or having the property borders identified. So that's going to automatically attach the SWPI C. Now you check that box, and there you go. You also would check the box, and I think right here in paragraph 4B, that the SWPI C is being attached to the purchase contract. Now, let's look at the SWPI C. This is a modification of the original SWPI. Okay, it's not entirely new, but it's now different. It's a little new in the sense that it's a lot more detailed, as you're going to see. So let's take a look at it really briefly. So of course, identify the parties and the property. And then what inspections and allocation of costs apply with the SWPI? So the inspection report, the location, all of the things that might cost money to happen. You check, who's going to pay for these things, buyer or the seller. And typically today, all these boxes get checked. And the seller say gets checked. That's pretty common. Some sellers counter back. They don't want to pay for some of these things. And that, part of the putting the contract together. Now, interestingly enough, when these reports have to be done by boilerplate within the first 7 days of the contract. Now, typically, septic inspections are not done at the beginning of the contract because they have a short shelf life, the inspection, the certification itself. So the contract has kind of recognized that now and said within 17 days of acceptance, they will excavate and access and certify the septic system so that can be done a little later in the transaction and still be in compliance with the contract. Pretty straightforward, but that's an interesting change there. Now, it's important to know that this SWPI C maintains a protection for the seller that the original SWPI had, and that is if anything, additional costs are necessary to get the septic system certified, then the payment of those costs must be agreed to by the seller. And so you seller agrees to certify the septic system. They do the inspection, and the septic inspector says, "Oh, it's going to cost you $2,000 because you got a cracked lid." And the seller says, "Oh, I don't have $2,000. I don't want to spend the $2,000." Well, he wouldn't be obligated to provide the certification because of this contract right here, this clause in the contract. If in order to get that certification or that clearance, repairs need to be made, and that causes additional costs, then the parties have to reach a new agreement, or an additional agreement might be a better phrase, in order for the seller to be compelled to pay those costs to provide that certification that they originally agreed to. So that is maintained, and this is carried over in a couple of other places, and you will see. So then well inspection, they've detailed the different parts of different things that can be inspected and certified, and who's paying for that. And again, that same disclaimer down at the end, if additional costs are needed to be paid, then the parties need to renegotiate the payment of those costs. Propane, and now this is good because, who's going to, pay to measure how much propane is left in the tank, and whether or not the remaining propane is going to convey, which is the boilerplate, or is the buyer going to reimburse the seller for the propane in the tank? This comes up from time to time. A lot of propane tanks on rural properties are on what we call an automatic fill, I guess. And so I'm going into escrow and I'm going to close on the 5th, and the propane company automatically fills it on the 2nd. And now I got an $800 bill and a full propane tank, and I'm not going to own the house 2 days later. And now the seller wants money for that. The old contract did not give the seller money for that. And so this is the boilerplate says that the seller would not get the money that gas, that propane would convey. Or you can check the box there and the buyer will reimburse the seller for the propane that's left in the tank. That's something real important to check on and make sure you cover that with your clients. And then finally, the same with property, monuments, corners, and boundaries, whether or not they want a surveyor. From a perspective of a seller, I would caution you, surveys are very expensive. Buyers might routinely ask for a property to be surveyed. We actually had a transaction recently, and won't name the agent. A good agent just had no clue that this was going to be more than $10,000. I think not quite 10,000 actually, to have it surveyed. And they just naively agreed that they just thought that, anybody could go out there and mark the corners, but the contract said marked by a surveyor. And that was a bit of a problem. Now they negotiated and got that resolved, but just be real careful with this. Okay. Now, there's also a new form that is a SWPI SWPI disclosure form, and that new form is now memorialized, and the seller is a part of the transaction, and it's a disclosure form. And the RPA paragraph 11 says in 11O that the seller will fill out the SWPI Q. I'm sorry, I said D, it's SWPI Q, SWPI questionnaire. And you're going to see, if you haven't seen it already, it's quite a questionnaire. And there is an affirmative obligation of the seller to complete that form now. And I'll talk about that and why that's critical and why there's so many questions on it from CAR's perspective. I think they're on the right track here. So let's take a look at the SWPI Q. This is a brand new form for the most part. And you can see that identify the property. It's a seller awareness, by the way. And this is a list of some of the questions. It's quite extensive. How many, by the way, if there's more than one septic system on the property, you would do a SWPI Q for both systems, not one for both. I mean, you would do 2 for both systems. Let me rephrase that. You would do 1 for each system, not 1 for both systems. That's a better way to say it. So you'd have 2 septic systems, you would have 2 SWPI Qs. Now you would answer all these questions. Now here's the challenge you've got. Seller's not going to know half these answers. CAR recognizes this. I recognize this. Those of you that are selling properties with septic systems routinely, you're looking at the list and saying, I don't think there's any way my seller knows half of this stuff. So you cannot know. Boy, I'm slipping up here. You cannot not know what you're aware of. So it doesn't say, what's the size of the tank? It asks, are you aware of the size of the tank? And if yes, I am aware, then what is it? But if you say, well, I have no clue on no, I'm not aware. See, so when you don't know, no is probably the answer. Well, obviously you're not aware. Example I use all the time is disclosures don't ask if the roof leaks. They ask, are you aware of a roof leak? And because the seller doesn't know if it leaks or not. Now, if he knows it leaks, he has to say yes. But if he says, I don't know if it leaks, well, you do know what you're aware of. So you don't know that it does, so you're not aware that it leaks. May sound like semantics, but it's really not. And so for these forms, these questions where the detail they're asking, the seller has no clue, he's probably going to ethically and with good faith say, I'm not aware of what, the answer to this question is. So then you would say, no, I'm not aware. And again, from a buyer's perspective, using my roof leak example, when the seller says I'm not aware of a roof leak, a buyer's agent has an obligation to say to the buyer, the seller is not saying it doesn't leak, because I get this all the time. There's not a month doesn't go by I don't get a couple of calls where the buyer says, seller said the roof didn't leak. I'd be very surprised, but if he did, okay. No, he said he's not aware of a leak. That's not the same thing as it doesn't leak. So it's just, that issue is the kind of issue that is going to play a lot with this SWPI, because buyers are going to close escrow and find out some of these things aren't to their liking, and they're going to say the seller didn't tell me this. Well, the seller didn't tell you because he wasn't aware of it. He checked no. So that should help your sellers fill out the form, and it should the buyer should be cautioned that when the seller says no, it's not an affirmative statement that there's not a problem. It's an affirmative statement that he's not aware of one, if that helps a little bit. Okay. Now, well, same sort of thing. They've added a ton of questions to the well disclosure portion of the SWPI queue. And you can get the form. You can look in the handout that we sent out, Lindsay sent out, and you can see all these questions in detail. So, well, questions all the way down to V. Propane, same thing. Bunch of questions for the propane. And then the seller is acting in good faith to say what he's aware of, and the agents are this transaction. They're not responsible for the seller's answers. Okay. Now, time periods for removing contingencies. I want to talk about that because Carr added this interesting little statement here. I suspect that maybe an arbitrator would pay attention to this. I'm not sure a small claims judge would. But if a buyer, if a seller after issuing a demand to close cancels the transaction and the buyer still has contingencies in place that have not been removed, the likelihood is the buyer would be able to demand his deposit back and prevail in any judicial proceeding because I have my contingencies. What Carr has recognized here is, look at this last sentence. The buyer is entitled to his deposit back if he has a condition, provided the buyer is acting in good faith to satisfy that contingency. So Neil Kalin had a good example on a webinar he did on loan contingency. So a buyer's trying to get his loan, but he's out of contract time frames, and the seller has a right to demand that they close because you're way late, your loan's not approved, and you pass closing. You give a demand to close escrow, and the buyer still got his loan contingency. The buyer would probably believe he's going to get his deposit back. And in fact, he probably would if every time the lender said, we need this, and the buyer said, okay, let me get it. We need that. Okay, let me get that. Well, you haven't been on the job long enough. You're going to have to get a statement from the seller, the employer, that you're going to keep you for, okay, let me get that. So the buyer's acting in good faith, but the lender just can't approve the loan yet. He would prevail. He'd get his deposit back. But the buyers decided, I don't want to buy the house anymore, and I'm not going to get the loan. And the buyer's not doing anything, but he's removed all his contingencies except the loan contingency, hasn't got the loan approved. But when the lender says, well, listen, we need you to do stuff, and the buyer's not doing it, the buyer's not acting in good faith, and the seller might keep the deposit. So I'm covering this. I'm hoping we don't open up a can of worms and suddenly Lots of sellers are demanding to keep deposits even though the buyer has contingencies. But again, if the buyer is not acting in good faith, the buyer should be advised you might have that, even though you have a contingency, that deposit might be at risk. So that's what this paragraph 14G talks about, and they've added that to the RPA, and that's pursuant to a recent court decision where a seller was granted the deposit money because the buyer sort of abandoned trying to buy the home and used its contingencies to demand his deposit back, and he didn't get it back as a result of that. So be aware of that. So the demand to close escrow, that's the form you use anytime you want to compel a closing. Do not use the notice of buyer to perform. Now, neither the demand to close escrow or the notice of buyer perform addresses what's going to become of the deposit uh, in a way that it, makes a determination. It does inform you that the deposit could be at risk, or you might be entitled to deposit back, but it doesn't determine whether you're going to get it back or not, nor should it, quite frankly. So a demand to close escrow to compel a closing, buyer doesn't close, now you cancel, you might still, even though a contingency is in place, you might still have a right to, the seller might have a right to the deposit, buyer might have the deposit at risk. Now, that's a little different in a notice to perform. In paragraph 14 of the RPA, 14C, if a seller cancels and the buyer has contingencies, the contract says, look at this last sentence here, seller shall, in C1, seller shall authorize the return of the buyer's deposit. Shall, by the way, is a promise. It's an obligation. So seller shall return the buyer's deposit except for the fees incurred by the buyer, which is a pretty standard statement. And that's because the buyer has the right to cancel pursuant to his contingencies, or I'm sorry, get his deposit back pursuant to his contingencies still being in place, but he didn't perform. The seller has a right to cancel, but the seller must return the deposit. It's the same concept with contract obligations. If the buyer is supposed to do something, he doesn't do it, and the seller gives him a notice to perform, then the seller, look at the second, the last paragraph down here at the end, second to last line, seller shall authorize the return of the buyer's deposit, except for fees incurred by the buyer. So that's if you try to compel a closing using a notice to buyer to perform, that's why from time to time an agent will call me and I'll say, never, 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 ever use a notice to buyer to perform to demand that the buyer close escrow. Why? Because of this very clause. Notice none of this is in red. Has existed in the contract for a long time, but I'm taking this opportunity to point this out to you because the subject has come up in my mind, an opportunity to share this with you because what they've done with the demand to close escrow, holy cow, buyer could lose his deposit even though he's got a contingency. So don't use a notice of buyer to perform to compel a closing because even if the buyer's removed all his contingencies, the contract says that if you cancel pursuant to a notice to perform, the seller shall authorize the return of the buyer's deposit. Hopefully no questions. If you do, put it in the chat, ask them at the end here. We'll go over it. Okay. Got a lot to cover here. Well, I kind of highlighted all of this for you and I talked right through it, so hopefully you have it. And so there's a notice to perform, different than the notice demand to close escrow, obviously, and never use the notice to perform to demand that the buyer or the seller, for that matter, close escrow. Use the demand to close escrow. There's other reasons too, but I won't go into those. Okay, now RPA paragraph 19. There's been a couple of changes also, and one is the FinCEN reporting, so-called FinCEN reporting, that's been on hold. in the state of Florida, the courts ruled that the Justice Department can require this information. In the state of Texas, by the way, the lenders are appealing Florida. In the state of Texas, they held that the government can't require this information, and that's on appeal by the government. So a little bit of a confusion there. So Department of Justice put the whole thing on hold as far as collecting the or requiring the reporting of the information. Some title companies, escrow companies, are still collecting information. We are not. Most, I believe, in Southern California are not, because they don't know how this will turn out. So this is sort of a clarification of what, whoops, what this is all about with the FinCEN, and that is possible that they may be required to provide that information to escrow. Okay. Counteroffers. The counteroffers have been modified, all three of them in the same way, and we'll take a look at that. And that's regarding liquidated damages. The liquidated damages, if in order for liquidated damages to be, or for arbitration to be required, the parties have to initial the appropriate paragraphs. And so with liquidated damages, especially, failure to initial those the paragraph regarding the fact that the deposit is considered liquidated damages for any breach by the buyer. If failure to initial that, you can't use that. You can't claim the deposit as your liquidated damages. That has to be agreed to as part of the agreement, and the paragraph has to be initialed. So on the counter, there's a box to check when the parties have not all of them initialed the liquidated damages clause. Now, where you have multiple buyers, you might have, let's say you have three buyers, you might have only two sets of initials and not the third buyer's initial. Well, then you don't have the right to do that, to keep the deposit as liquidated damages in the event of a breach, because it wasn't initialed by all the parties to the contract. So the counteroffers provide for a fact to state that the liquidated damages agreement will be incorporated into this counter. And that's the new form, the LDAA, Liquidated Damages and Arbitration Agreement. It's the same with the arbitration. And let's take a look at that form. By the way, the down payment and loan amount and deposit and credits, they will be adjusted as the sales price adjusts. So the loan amount, if they're getting an 80% loan and then the price goes up, they're still getting an 80% loan, the loan will be larger. So down payments and loan amounts adjust. Deposits and credits do not. Okay. Hopefully that's clear to everybody. All right, and it talks about the appraisal gap. That should be deducted from the final purchase price to determine the appraisal contingency. And the appraisal gap is that number now, my example, 25,000. That would be deducted from the final sale price. As the price went up, that 25,000 would carry over. So I bought it for 950. I said I would pay up to 25,000 over the appraisal. The way I wrote it, 25,000, put that in the blank. And now the price got up to, $1.2 million, significantly higher because it was, multiple bids. I'm still only going to pay up 25,000. That contingency rather is still only going to be 25,000 below the sale price. All right, this is the new form. Liquidated damages and arbitration agreement. And it's pretty straightforward. It just brings those two clauses that are in the RPA into a standalone form for purposes of getting additional initials. All right. So the liquidated damages, the principals would initial here. Let's say the principals didn't initial it, or two principals did, but the third one didn't. Well, then you would get the third one, and I would get all of them on this form. So all of the principals are initialing it. And likewise with arbitration, additional room for the other principals to initial when you have either they didn't initial it the first time, maybe that was an oversight. Now, if they did not intend to initial them, then don't initial this form either. No, I didn't initial that on the offer because I don't agree, and I'm not going to initial it on this counter either. You've included the form in the counter, but I'm not initialing it because I don't believe in liquidated damages, or I don't believe in arbitration. This is particular one is arbitration. All right. Residential listing contract. The only change to the residential listing contract is further clarification about what this additional compensation to seller's broker is all about. And I think we've covered that pretty well, but I wanted to bring this to your attention. It should be even easier to present this to your sellers because now there's quite a bit of, it won't be in red on your form, of course, but it will talk about the fact that there's an additional effort needed to facilitate this transaction if the buyer's not represented. And I'm the only real estate agent in the transaction. I don't represent the buyer, but I'm now doing a lot more than I would if the buyer were represented. And so this helps, I think, convince a seller that it's a good idea for me. I mean, it's reasonable for me to ask for additional compensation when an unrepresented buyer buys the property. And again, as most of you know, I've covered this. I think we haven't seen a lot of issues with this. This is not a dual agency compensation. The dual agency compensation would be the buyer pays you, and of course the buyer is going to ask the seller to cover it for the buyer, and the seller pays you. So, but the listing agreement doesn't cover dual agency compensation. Nowhere does it appear. But it does cover what I'm paid to represent the seller and what I might be paid in addition if and this is additional. This isn't the total. So if this is 2.5 or 3, and you want another 1.5, the 1.5 would go on this line. And it's additional compensation to the seller's broker, me, the listing agent, because the buyer is unrepresented by me or any other broker. Okay, seller advisories had a couple of new paragraphs, and one is all for all cash entity buyers. And it talks about that FinCEN reporting. And there are certain properties that the reporting might be necessary. So that's at this time, not a big deal. The really interesting thing is that wholesale buyers, there's an advisory now to sellers to be aware of some of the challenges of what a so-called wholesaler buyer might present to the seller. And that's a buyer who's buying it with the sole purpose of offering it to another buyer and then doing an assignment during escrow, and the buyer is going to be replaced by a new buyer. And there are some challenges in transactions with that reasonable, that's a fact. And this is sort of advising the seller that these are the kinds of things that you might not, because a lot of sellers aren't happy that investors are now wholesaling the property to another buyer because that other buyer is paying more than what the investor paid. And the seller might think, well, I could have sold it for that, and now I'm getting delayed. I got more problems. And so this is just sort of an advisory to the buyer to be aware of it. It doesn't say don't do it. It just tells them what they should look out for and be aware of, and how to identify a potential wholesale buyer. And then open house, they've added a little bit of language about open house and security and protect your possessions and all of that. And most of you do a pretty good job advising your sellers on things to be careful of when you're holding their house open. Okay, the seller property questionnaire, that has been improved in one very big way. And this is the old contract, the old SBQ, I'm sorry. And they talked about all these reports and estimates and prior reports from prior escrows and reports the seller still had from when they bought the property and maybe reports the seller got during their ownership of the property. And it lumped it all into one paragraph. And we've had problems ourselves, and Carr maintains they've had quite a few problems, the industry has, with sellers having information they didn't provide to the buyer that wasn't part of the transaction. It was a previous inspection. It was something the buyer had inspected. It was something the buyer was aware of when he bought the seller rather, was aware of when they bought the property, and now they're not passing that on to the new buyer 4 years later. And this covered it all, but was so broad that most sellers probably didn't appreciate this. So this paragraph 5 has been replaced by this new paragraph 5, and they detail it far more. And I won't read this in the interest of time, but this is a big improvement because this is really specifying the kinds of things a seller wants to be aware of that they should be providing their buyer if they have these kinds of things in their possession. And it makes it easier for current buyers to ask sellers, do you have any of this stuff? Because it's part of the SBQ. And it does alert sellers and listing agents to be sure to provide this because failure to provide that could make the seller liable in a subsequent claim by the current buyer after he closes escrow. So read through that. It's in your handout, but this, I believe, is a big improvement. And so I think it'll help a lot. Okay, the buyer representation and broker compensation, there's been only one change to that. It's kind of significant. And so amount of compensation, of course, we're all familiar with that. And that's in paragraph 2E1, and that's where the buyers asking, the buyer's agent is asking for the buyers to compensate them X amount of dollars for representing them, and that's part of the agreement. So now what happens when the buyer assigns the transaction to a new buyer? Well, they've added a paragraph to paragraph 4B, and that is that the buyer's obligation to compensate their agent transfers with the assignment. And so if and that is whether or not, interestingly enough, as you're going to see, I think I have a slide for it, the agent represents the new buyer. If the agent doesn't represent the new buyer, there have been arguments made, well, the buyer, listen, I assigned it, so now it's up to you to get an agreement with that new buyer. And the new buyer, I don't need you. I mean, I found this house myself. I bought these properties before. I don't need to pay you. Now the poor buyer's agent who put the first buyer into escrow out in the cold. Not so much anymore because of the way they added this to the BRBC to protect the buyer's agent. Okay, the PRBS has been replaced. Now, they've kept the PRBS for a while. The intent is probably to phase it out, but they kept it. It was a generic form for buyers and sellers, and now they've created two forms, a PRBS-S, which for sellers, and that no longer does the PRBS or the PRBS-S or PRBS-B, those two forms bundle with the S with the RLA, the listing contracts, all of them, not just the RLA, and the PRBSB buyer bundles with BRBC, and neither one of them bundle with the RPA. In the old days, the PRBS, old days being yesterday or the day before yesterday, the PRBS bundled with the RPA, but that's a little late to get permission to represent more than one buyer and seller and permission to be a dual agent. Uh, that should have happened when you listed the property. That should have happened when you uh, listed the buyer, when you signed the buyer up to buyer representation agreement. And when you're doing an RPA, it's too late, quite frankly. So they corrected that by bundling it in the correct place. Now, yesterday, I left a message for Carr. It was after hours, and I didn't discover it. One of our TCs did and alerted me because she was confused, and she she explained to me the problem. The PRBS bundled with both the listing contract and the buyer representation agreement, which is a little problematic. The PRBSB should bundle with the buyer representation, the BRBC. And so hopefully they got that message first thing this morning because I left it last night, and they fixed it. I would think it's an easy fix to get the right form bundled. So check that in the next day or two. If you're taking a buyer representation agreement with a buyer, make sure you have a like Paul, PRBSB. And so the form is pretty straightforward. It talks about buyers and multiple sellers and dual agency. That's the PRBS and the PRBSS, and the PRBSB has the same, but it also offers this. Offers are not confidential. The buyer needs to know that. So a listing agent can disclose a buyer's offer to a buyer, to other buyers with the seller's permission. So offers are not confidential, and so that's part of the BRBSB. Now, it's not part of the RLA because you're not making an offer. So, but to disclose a offer that a buyer has made and you're the listing agent, you do want the seller's permission to do that. And some sellers, it's two schools of thought. It's up, you and the seller decide which one you believe in. Telling the other side about the offer you got might compel the new buyer, the second buyer, to make an attempt to beat that offer. But the problem you might have is they only beat it by a little bit. And if you don't tell them the offer, they might have beat it by a whole lot more, thinking that they had to. So before you disclose what offers you have as a listing agent, be sure your seller is on the same page you are. But again, with buyers, they need to be told their offer is not confidential unless they've signed an NDA, a confidentiality agreement, which is not common in residential real estate. Okay, and in the final form, we'll wrap it up here, almost done, is the assignment agreement. I want to talk a little bit about that. And so the one big change is that the representation. So the boilerplate says that the buyer's broker will represent the assignee as well. And so the buyer assigns his interest in the property to a new buyer, and the representation of that new buyer will continue by the same buyer's agent who's now representing the new buyer, not the old buyer anymore, because the old buyer is not part of the contract anymore. And that's the boilerplate. Now, if you check B, no, the buyer's broker will not represent the assignee. Assignee's got options about how he wants to be represented. So the assignee is not represented by a broker, and the assignee, that's the boilerplate, or the assignee will be represented by a different broker. Now, if the assignee is going to be represented by the original buyer's broker, then the boilerplate in A applies. But if the buyer's broker is not representing the assignee, the person who has been assigned to, you would check B here, and then If he's not having any representation, that's the boilerplate. Or if he's having somebody else represent him, you can identify that person. And then any questions should be directed to either the seller's broker or to the assignee's broker, new broker, not the original broker. Okay. Now, the obligation of the seller to compensate the buyer's broker shall not be altered by this assignment. However, that payment is now going to the original broker. Now, if the original broker represents the new buyer as well, it's the same person. You only collect one fee, and that's not a problem. But if the assignee wants to have a different broker and have that broker be paid by the seller, that would have to be a separate agreement. And if the seller agreed, he should be advised that you already have an obligation to pay the first buyer's broker, because the assignment doesn't change that. Hopefully, I've not confused you. I don't want to go through it 2 or 3 times because time is important here, almost running a little long. But if you have any questions, we'll talk about it here in the Q&A section. But once the seller is agreeing to compensate the buyer's broker, the assignment doesn't relieve the obligation to pay that broker. Now, if he's going to pay a new buyer broker in addition, he can do that, but the first buyer's broker would still be entitled to payment. Now, that's where, again, the new buyer has a different broker. But if the new buyer has the same broker, then this isn't an issue at all. But Carr recognizes this is an interesting little quandary that could come up, and they've nicely addressed that in the assignment. Okay, now additional terms. The thing that is important is that paragraph 5C, the buyer acknowledges and agrees that notwithstanding this assignment agreement, the buyer is not released from the obligations under the agreement. So if, in simple English, what that means is if the assignee doesn't perform, the assignor, the original buyer, is still obligated to perform. And that's part of every assignment, car assignment. So that's important to be aware of. And then finally, it restates it again without releasing. When the seller agrees the assignment, he's not releasing the buyer, which the buyer is not the assignee in this agreement. The buyer is the first buyer. He's not releasing that buyer, and it clearly says that when he assigns it. All right. Folks, that's it. I'm going to stop the share. Lindsay, do we have questions?
There's no questions in the chat, but perhaps somebody would like to ask a question.
Anybody have questions? Anybody raise their hand?
Well, it's Nora. Clarification on the compensation 2G, was it 2G, did you say?
2G,
Oh, no,
2,
3G2?
3G2, yeah, okay.
Where you said we could put the compensation in there as well?
No. You could put something as simple as seller concession.
Oh, okay.
Now, if there's no blank, if the 3G3 is not filled out, that concession could be used by the buyer to pay his agent, but that will be counted against the allowables of the lender.
That's what I was going to clarify. So anything in 3G2 has to be submitted to the lender and would go against allowable.
Exactly. The
Okay.
lender would have to agree to that.
If it's a concession, make sure to put it in 3G3 or 3G3, yes.
Well, no, a concession to, buy my rate down, a concession to replace the carpet.
Yeah, credit. Okay.
Yeah, any credit that goes to pay my broker. I'm the buyer, and I want the seller to pay that too. I agreed to pay my buyer broker 2.5%, but I and my broker both agreed we're going to ask the seller to cover that.
Okay.
That belongs in 3G3.
Yes. Okay.
Right. Now, if you have a 2.5% as a concession and 2.5% in 3G3, that seller is paying 5%.
Okay.
And let's say the loan only allows 3%. he's still paying 5%. Why? Because the lender is not going to count what's in 3G3 against the 3% allowance. Does that make
Got it.
sense? So
Yes.
anytime commission is involved that you're paying the buyer broker, that should be in 3G3.
Okay, perfect.
And
Thank
I
you.
just use the word concession that you can itemize it.
Yeah.
2% buy down the rate, 2% for carpet credit, 2% to HOA dues for the next year, 2% to cover the property taxes for the next year. You can put anything there. You can put the word concessions in there. And that's just to itemize what that's for. The 3G3 is specifically for buyer broker compensation. And
Got
the
it.
benefit of separating them is you don't have the buyer broker compensation apply against the maximum allowables for credits that the lender will
Exactly.
allow.
When you're on the buyer side. Okay,
Exactly.
thanks.
Yeah,
Okay.
Walt.
Go ahead, Linda.
Yeah. Yeah, Walt, my concern is when you're when you're using any words other that would involve repairs or new carpet
Bingo.
or anything like that, that might be a red flag to the lender. The concept of paying homeowners dues or anything like that, no problem. But when you use anything that a lender might interpret as a red flag, I would stay away from that.
I think, Linda, you're correct. I was going to make that comment and it just sort of flew out of my head. You're very perceptive. But agents should be aware that I would avoid any reference to the condition of the property. Now, Carr actually uses an example of a carpet credit, but Linda's correct. I think a lender could look at that carpet credit and say, well, wait a minute, you got bad carpet there. We want new carpet. And even worse, repair credit. Oh my gosh, don't put that down. So be very careful when you itemize what that concession might be for, because the lender, if you're talking to a loan rep, you can be pretty candid with them. And if he says, no, 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 we're fine, the carpet's fine, don't worry about it. Well, you can put it down if you want. But why? You don't need to. Use the money for whatever you want. You're right, Linda.
There
Thank
is
you.
a question in the chat now.
Okay.
It says if the seller has agreed to pay the buyer's broker and the buyer assigns the purchase to a new buyer, is the seller obligated to pay the first broker and the second broker?
Well, no, he will only pay the second broker if he agreed to pay the second broker. There's the same RPA. There's only one RPA. And that RPA says the first buyer's broker gets paid.
Even
And
if
that does not go away with an assignment.
okay.
Now, if typically, and that's why the boilerplate, go back to that assignment slide. I won't open it up here, take the time, but go back to the assignment in your handout. It's the last couple pages of your handout. The seller is obligated, the assignment doesn't alter the seller's obligations under the RPA. So the seller is obligated to pay the buyer's broker. The buyer is identified as the first buyer. The assignee is the second buyer. So I represent a buyer, put him in escrow, and that buyer assigns this to another buyer. And that buyer doesn't want me to represent him. He's got his own broker. Seller's going to pay me. And the seller's not obligated to pay the assignee's broker unless there's a separate agreement, a unique addendum or amendment stating that. But the assignment does not alter the seller's obligations to pay the first broker. Does that clarify the question? Hopefully it does.
It did for me.
Yeah.
I have a question.
And by the way, that was real perceptive of Carr to address that in the assignment. I thought that was excellent. I hadn't thought about that, but actually what I said to myself is, I'm surprised this hasn't come up already. We've been doing this BRBC for now more than a few years. Somebody, hey, I'm not paying that first broker anymore, because he doesn't represent the buyer.
Emma has a question.
Yes,
Hi.
Emma.
I have a question on the grandson signed as a power of attorney. So when the grandson signs, he should put grandma's name, printed name there, his own name there. And when he signs with a pencil pen, whose name he's signing, he's
Is this a
pretending.
power of attorney? The
Yeah.
grandson has a power of attorney?
Yes.
All right. So we're going to call grandma's name Grandma. That's her name.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to call the son's name grandson. That's
Yeah.
his name. He's going to sign Grandma.
Oh, okay.
That's what he's going to sign. Now, it won't look like grandma's signature. It'll look like grandson's signature. But he needs, the law requires that grandma's signature be on that document. Now, if the grandson put that on the document and had no authority to do it, he's committing fraud.
Mm-hmm.
But he got a power of attorney. Grandma said, I'm too old. I don't want to sign it. You sign for me. See, that's the key. So grandson can sign grandma's name legally. Why? Because he has a power of attorney. Now, interesting, not getting the weeds too much and get off topic. You don't need a power of attorney to be in writing, believe it or not.
Oh, okay.
There's no law that says the power of attorney has to be in writing. Now, real property transactions require it because title companies won't insure it without it being written and recorded. They have to record it. So it has to be not only in writing, but of a certain format. So grandma gives grandson the permission to execute documents for her. He must sign her name first on every document he executes for her. Then, because she didn't sign it, he did, he signs his name. So, and then next to or after that, it'll say POW, power of attorney, attorney in fact. So the document will say grandma, grandson, POW. Or
POA.
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 I'm sorry, POW.
Not prisoner of war.
I know. Thinking
So
back to Vietnam
he
days.
he actually signs for both. Signs both name. Grandma first, then himself, then
Bingo.
put POA.
Got it right.
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 Or
Yeah, that's right.
attorney in fact.
Great question. Hopefully that's clear to
Okay.
everybody.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got to have grandma's signature. You've got to have the principal's signature because she's still the owner of the property. Power of attorney doesn't give the person holding the power of attorney permission to sell it in spite of grandma. Grandma has to agree to sell it. He just executes that for her on her behalf.
Got it. Thank you.
By the way, that's why power of attorneys cannot be granted by people who are incapacitated. So someone, now grandma is got dementia. So we're going to go get a power of attorney. No, you're not. not an ethical one anyway, because grandma has to be of sound mind to grant the power of attorney. Now, once the power of attorney is granted, grandma can then lose it. I mean, now she was good last year, but this year she's completely out of it. That power of attorney is still valid as long as it hasn't expired.
I think Sunshine has a question.
Yes. Shoot. Go.
Yeah, that works better. When you're at the beginning where you're doing the entity signatures and things, to set that up on either one of the forms, do we put the trust name first, and then when it goes to signing, then they sign their trustee name, or how does that work? Because where does the only place that the trust name shows up is in that entity section?
The trust name can appear in the seller line in the top of the contract. It can appear there. Or the trustee's name can appear there, either one. Now, what I've been told, and I keep saying, call me if this isn't right. I should say, call me if I am right, just so I can be good. But I've been told if you start at the front of the form and in seller, put the name of the trust, that trust name populates on the signature lines.
Yes.
But if you start at the bottom of the form and put the authorized signer, Walt Klein, it's the Mesa Madeira Wonderful Property Trust. That's the name of my trust. And Walt Klein is the trustee. If I fill out Walt Klein trustee authorized signer on the RCSD at the end of the form, that gets picked up. I think that's the way it kind of works.
Okay.
Somebody called me and
so I could put the Walt Klein trustee, as the seller, but then when I get down to the to that entity part, that's where I put in the name of the trust, and the signer is still
Yeah.
Walter
If I
Klein.
followed you right, you could put Walt Klein as the seller trustee. Courts will allow that.
Okay.
So that,
It's very confusing to me because
it can
what I
be,
usually
right.
did was put their trustee name, and then I put the name of the trust as the second seller, and it got,
Yeah, no, don't do that. It will screw you up. Okay.
well, yeah. All right. I'm already screwed up. So
And the good news is I want to just make this point, and that's why Lindsay and I have talked about it. We had one TC that took issue with our efforts to just set a standard and make it clear to everybody. Uh, I will tell you, courts are somewhat flexible, lenient, I'm not sure that word is, when it comes to trust and trust signatures and things like that. They're not, it can go kind of different ways. They are not with entities and power of attorneys. And if you've ever formed a corporation and you've had an attorney involved in that, they're going to lecture you about you don't ever sign anything without ink next to it, president next to it, because you put just your name on this, Walt. You have now pierced the corporate veil. Ooh, that sounds horrible. Yeah, it is horrible because now your personal assets are available to any litigant who can produce a document. He signed this with his name. Yeah, and see, so that's why we put that memo out because and same with power of attorneys. Use Bob, grandson, back to Emma's example, grandson signs grandson, and then grandma. Courts have invalidated that. Grandson didn't have an authority to prove this document, and grandma doesn't hold the power of attorney. Why? Because you put the wrong order, and that has gone to court, and the guy who had it in the wrong order lost. So two of those three things, courts are not very lenient, but with trusts, you can fudge a little bit and probably get away with it.
okay, so then on all the other disclosures, the generic boilerplate disclosures, we need to get that needs to be all trustee also.
Well, yeah, you could put the trustee who's filling it out, the trustee. Sure, I would use the trustee as much as possible on disclosures because
All right.
they're the ones filling it out.
Try to remember to put that all in there.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank
By
you.
the way, I didn't mention it. I meant to, and I forgot. People get hung up on initials. No, initials are fine. You don't need a title next to the initials. So Walt Klein trustee or Walt Klein president of Walt Klein Inc. WC, you're fine. The courts aren't going to look at the initials and say, you pierced the corporate veil. They're not going to do that. You didn't sign this as the initials of the trustee. No, initials are initials. That's fine.
What about the other way around, Walt? So if the agent puts like Walt Klein, comma, trustee as the digital signature, then the initials automatically populate WCT. Is that going to be an issue?
No, that'd be okay.
Okay.
Yeah, further clarification, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. That's all the questions I have in the chat.
Other hands? Great.
Yep.
All right. Well, folks, have a great rest of the day. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Good crowd today. Appreciate that. And any questions, give Linda a call. I know she'll help you. Give me a call. Give Lindsay a call. Give Eric a call. We're here to help. So
Thank you.
take
Bye,
care.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.